The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like trapped insects, casting everything in that particular shade of institutional white that made time feel suspended. Seattle General in Atlanta sprawled across 12 floors of gleaming tile and stainless steel, where the smell of antiseptic couldn't quite mask the underneath, copper, decay, the smell of bodies fighting to stay alive. Rachel Torres had worked night shift here for 4 months. Nobody remembered her name. She pushed through the staff entrance at 10:47 p.m., badge clipped to her scrub pocket, her sneakers silent on the floor. The evening nurses were giving report in the hallway, their voices a familiar drone of medications and vitals and the 100 small crises that made up a hospital ward. Rachel moved past them like water around stone. This was her rhythm now: stay invisible, stay competent, stay unremarkable. Let them see a temp nurse with kind eyes and steady hands. Let them see someone with nothing underneath. Her hands weren't steady at all, but she'd had practice hiding that. The scars on her palms had faded to white lines over 18 months, pale against her olive skin, barely visible unless you look close. She wore her wedding ring on her right hand instead of her left, a small defiance that probably meant nothing to anyone but her. The ring was simple gold, worn thin from years of use, and sometimes when she was alone in the medication room, she would turn it once around her finger like a talisman. The night charge nurse, Patricia, waved her over from the central station. Patricia was good people. She didn't condescend, didn't ask unnecessary questions, just handed Rachel the assignment sheet and a cup of coffee that smelled like it had been sitting since the day shift. "Room for 08 is our difficult discharge," Patricia said, tapping the sheet. "Seal with gunshot wounds from Ramadi. Been in a coma for 3 weeks. Woke up 2 days ago but he's not tracking, not engaging. Neuroconsult says traumatic brain injury. Lots of confusion, some aggression. He's on cue for vitals and continuous monitoring. Keep the door locked when you're in there." "And Rachel?" "He's had exactly 0 visitors. Nobody knows who he is." Rachel nodded, taking the sheet. "Room for 08. 3rd floor, far east wing, away from the main nursing station." She'd seen the unit patch on his jacket when they brought him in, faded olive drab, sewn so carefully it must have meant something to someone. The coffee was terrible. She drank it anyway. By 11:30 p.m., the night shift had settled into its peculiar rhythm. The ER was quiet. The surgical floors hummed with sleeping patients. Rachel finished checking the first 3 rooms on her assignment: Mrs. Chen with her kidney stones, Mr. Williams post-op from a hernia repair, a teenager with appendicitis waiting for discharge paperwork. She charted everything in clean, precise notes, documented vitals, adjusted for rates with the kind of muscle memory that came from doing this 1,000 times before. Then she came to room for 08. The door was marked with a yellow sign: contact precautions, standard isolation. She knocked, waited, then stepped inside. The room was dark except for the monitors, which threw blue light across everything like an underwater cave. The machines beeped in their rhythmic pattern: heart rate, blood pressure, oxygen saturation. The sounds of a body still fighting. The man in the bed opened his eyes as she approached. He was maybe 40, maybe older, with a kind of weathered face that came from living in desert heat. His left arm was in a cast. His right arm lay across his stomach, and even in the dim light, Rachel could see the bandaging, not just from the gunshot wounds, but from something else. Something deliberate. Her breath caught in her throat, but she held it steady. She moved closer to take his vitals, keeping her movement slow and predictable. She'd learned in training that traumatic brain injury patients often couldn't process sudden movements, that you had to move like you were approaching a spooked animal. "Good evening," she said, keeping her voice level and low. "I'm Rachel. I'm going to check your blood pressure." He didn't respond. His eyes tracked her, but there was nothing behind them, no recognition, no comprehension, just the blank stare of someone looking at a stranger. She wrapped the cuff around his arm. His skin was warm. Underneath the hospital-issue gown, she could see the edge of a tattoo on his right forearm. She leaned in slightly, as if to read the monitor, and her eyes caught the ink. 3 letters. Rat. And below it, a date. 1847 hours. Remedy. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing didn't change. She finished taking his blood pressure, 128/74, elevated but stable, and made her notes in precise handwriting. Her wedding ring caught the blue light from the monitor as she wrote. The man's eyes followed her hands. Followed the ring. But there was still nothing there. No spark of memory. No recognition of the face that had been the last thing he saw before everything went dark 3 weeks ago in a place that didn't exist anymore. Rachel had carried him 3 miles through enemy fire. She'd felt his blood soaking through her uniform, felt the weight of his body against hers as she moved through the sandstorm, felt the moment his heartbeat stuttered and nearly stopped. She had run through that kill zone with his name tattooed on her own skin for 6 years, a thin scar on her ribs where the letters were burned in with a needle and ash and seawater, and he was looking at her like she was a nurse he'd never met before. "Your oxygen is good," she told him, her voice still level. "You're doing fine." She adjusted his for drip, checked the infusion rate, made sure the monitor leads were secure. Professional. Mechanical. The kind of competence that came from training, from muscle memory, from the part of her that had learned to turn off everything else and just work. "I'll be back in an hour," she said, and she turned to leave. "Who are you?" His voice was rough from the breathing tube, from 3 weeks of sedation and recovery. She paused at the door. She didn't turn around. "I'm your night nurse," she said. "My name is Rachel. I'll check on you in an hour." She left the room and locked the door behind her, just like Patricia had said. Then she went to the medication room and stood there for exactly 90 seconds, breathing slowly and deliberately, her hands braced on the edge of the counter. The monitors she could monitor. The medication she could manage. The man with her name tattooed on his skin but no memory of her face, that was data she couldn't process yet. She had come to Seattle General with a mission that had nothing to do with medical care. For months ago, someone high up in naval intelligence had noticed a pattern: medical supplies disappearing from hospital inventory in Atlanta, expensive stuff, painkillers, and anesthetics flowing into black market channels. The trail led to arms dealers. The arms dealers led to a man who had money and power and connections that went deep into the hospital system. Her assignment was simple: get inside the hospital, find out who was running the theft ring, and document the chain of custody. Keep her head down. Stay invisible. Don't get noticed. She had been invisible until they brought him in. Until they put him in room 408 with a faded unit patch on his jacket and a memory as blank as the hospital walls. By 2 a.m., Rachel was finishing charting when the elevator doors opened at the far end of the hallway. A man stepped out, tall and lean, moving with the kind of purposeful stride that made people instinctively step aside. He was wearing a navy blazer despite the hour, his tie still knotted tight against his throat, his shoes polished to a shine. He carried a tablet like a weapon. This was Dr. Marcus Hayes, chief of surgery. She'd seen him briefly on day shift 3 weeks ago, but they'd never spoken. She'd made a point of staying out of his way. He walked directly to the nursing station and set his tablet down with a sharp click. Patricia looked up, startled. It was 2 o'clock in the morning. No surgeon came to the hospital at 2 o'clock in the morning unless something was wrong. "I'm reviewing night shift assignments," Hayes said, his voice clipped and precise. He was looking at Patricia, not at Rachel. "Effective immediately, I want the temp assignment rotated. She's too new, too inconsistent. Split her between pediatrics and the surgical floor. No continuity of care on any single patient." Patricia frowned. "Rachel's been solid. No complaints from." "It wasn't a question," Hayes said. He glanced over at Rachel then, a brief assessment, the kind of look you'd give a piece of furniture. Nothing malicious. Just invisible. Just a moment of acknowledgement before he moved his attention away. His eyes didn't linger on her face. Didn't seem to register anything at all. "New assignment starts tomorrow," he said to Patricia. "Surgical floor, 3 to 11. Then pediatrics, 11 to 7. Rotate every 3 days. I want documentation of every interaction she has with patient files. And she doesn't have access to any floor above the 3rd floor. Clear. Dr. Hayes, I don't think we have the authority to restrict her. Then get authorization from administration, he said, and he was already walking away, his shoes clicking against the tile floor. I'm chief of surgery. I can restrict access to whoever I want for whatever reason. Patient safety, Patricia. It's not negotiable. He left the same way he'd arrived. The elevator closed behind him. The hallway went quiet except for the monitors, the ventilator hiss, the endless beeping of machines keeping people alive. Patricia looked at Rachel and gave her a small apologetic shrug. I don't know what that was about. He seemed upset about something. Rachel was already thinking through the implications. Her access restricted. Her schedule fragmented. No continuity. No time to build a pattern. No way to stay in one place long enough to see anything, to connect anything, to understand what was happening in the supply chain or who was moving what through the hospital network. This wasn't random. Someone had flagged her. Someone had noticed her paying attention. She finished her charts and made her rounds. Room for 08 at 1 a.m., the patient sleeping, his oxygen saturation good, his heart rate steady. She took his vitals and didn't let her eyes linger on the tattoo on his forearm. That was yesterday. That was a different life. That was a version of Rachel Torres that didn't exist anymore, and the version that did was running out of time. The silence before grand rounds was the kind that made you count your heartbeats. Rachel stood at the edge of the conference room, tablet clutched against her ribs, watching 23 residents file in like medical students entering a cathedral. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless mechanical prayer. Dr. Hayes stood at the podium, immaculate in his white coat, already scanning the crowd with the look of a man who'd decided something about the day before it started. She should have known. The way he'd been leaving her charts on the break room table, corners folded back like accusations. The way he'd lingered over her documentation on the monitors yesterday, shaking his head in a way designed to be noticed. I want to talk about precision, Hayes said, his voice filling the room the way smoke fills a corridor. Hospital rankings depend on documentation accuracy. Our complication rates. Our readmission numbers. Everything flows from charting discipline. Rachel's jaw tightened. Just an observation, she told herself. Just a lecture. She'd heard worse. We have someone on staff, Hayes continued, and the way the residents' heads turned told her everything, who seems to believe that shortcuts are acceptable. Coffee shop quality work. Charting gaps. Vague assessments. He held up a patient file. Her patient file. Room 307, a post-op gallbladder removal. Look at this documentation. This is the standard we should all aspire not to follow. The residents looked. 3 of them actually smirked. A younger woman, fresh out of residency, leaned over to her colleague and whispered something that made him smile. Rachel could hear her own breathing now, the sound of it measured and controlled as a metronome. She did not move. Did not flinch. The trembling that wanted to start in her hands, she locked it down, clamped it down like a pressure valve, and held her face exactly where it was. These gaps, Hayes said, turning another page, suggest either incompetence or carelessness. Perhaps both. In my experience, temp staff bring a certain flexibility with hospital standards. The words landed like stones in still water. Temp. The word he always used when he wanted to remind her that she was borrowed, temporary, disposable. Rachel's vision narrowed to the back of his neck. Just the neck. Just the soft place where his collar met his skin. Not the face. Not the eyes. If she looked at his eyes, something in her would break that couldn't be put back together quietly. So when you're reviewing post-operative assessments, Hayes said, ask yourself, is this the standard I want representing Seattle General in an audit? Is this the work of someone committed to excellence? Or is this someone just passing through? One measured breath. In. Hold. Out. Rachel took it. Her eyes felt hot, that pressure behind them that meant tears were forming, but she was faster than her own body. She'd spent 18 years learning to be faster than her own body. One tear slipped loose before she could stop it, and she reached up with her index finger, not moving her hand away from her body, just a small movement, efficient, and wiped it without breaking her gaze from the back of the room. The residents were looking at her now. She could feel them. The woman who brought gas station coffee. The woman with the steady hands but apparently the careless mind. Hayes folded the file. Excellence requires discipline. Discipline requires people who are invested in their institution. Questions. A resident's hand went up. Then another. Hayes launched into a discussion about sepsis protocols, and Rachel waited for the moment when the room's attention would shift away from her. 30 seconds. 45. When it did, she lifted her chin slightly and met his eyes. Just for a moment. Just long enough for him to see that the tear was gone. Just long enough for him to see her looking back. That was her mistake. He saw the composure. He saw that she hadn't shattered. And something in his face shifted, like a predator recognizing that the prey was larger than he'd initially calculated. The break room smelled like burnt coffee and the strange staleness of a space that never got enough natural light. Rachel had timed it perfectly. 2:47 p.m. on a Thursday meant most of the day shift had already eaten, and the night crew hadn't arrived yet. She was standing in front of the vending machine, inserting bills into the slot, when Hayes appeared in the doorway like a thought made flesh. Stocking up. His voice carried that manufactured lightness that was somehow worse than anger. Worse because it was deliberate. Rachel's hand froze on the button. Colombian roast, medium. Same thing she selected every shift. She withdrew her coffee cup from the dispenser and turned to face him. Just break room coffee, doctor. Gas station coffee, isn't it? He moved closer, his cologne arriving before his body did, something expensive and sharp. I saw you coming back from the Circle K on the corner. With that thermos. Very resourceful. He paused, letting the pause work for him. Or very budget-conscious, I suppose. The fluorescent lights buzzed. Somewhere down the hall, a monitor beeped in a steady rhythm. Rachel gripped the thermos cup, feeling its warmth against her palms, and said nothing. Saying nothing was sometimes the only honest thing left to say. The cafeteria has decent coffee, Hayes continued. Institutional, but respectable. Included in your temp stipend, actually. But I understand if money is tight. No judgment. There it was. The cruelty dressed up in concern. The blade wrapped in sympathy. Rachel had seen men like this in Iraq, officers who never raised their voices, who broke people with courtesy and precision. She'd learned to recognize the pattern, to understand that the kindest-sounding words were often the ones designed to wound deepest. I prefer it this way, Rachel said. Her voice came out exactly as she intended it to sound, calm, level, almost conversational. Excellence doesn't require an audience, doctor. The words hung between them like a held breath. She watched his face change, but tightening around the eyes, a slight compression of the mouth. He'd expected her to crumble, or to defend herself, or to apologize. He hadn't expected her to respond at all, and certainly not with something that sounded almost like a quote, almost like philosophy, almost like she was finished speaking now and he could either continue this conversation with himself or leave. For a moment, they stood like that in the break room with the fluorescent lights humming overhead and the vending machine's motor cooling in the background. Then Hayes smiled. It was a thin smile, the kind that reached his mouth but never his eyes. You know, he said, I've been meaning to talk to you about patient safety protocols. The shift had been long. Not because of the hours, Rachel had pulled back-to-back doubles in Ramadi that made a 12-hour hospital shift feel like a coffee break, but because of the wait. The particular heaviness of being watched. Of existing in a space where someone had decided you were the problem, and every choice you made was being catalogued, documented, filed away for future use against you. It happened during the 11 p.m. medication verification rounds. Rachel was reviewing orders on the electronic system, cross-checking the 0800 insulin protocol for a type 2 diabetic in room for 12 when she noticed something. The order had been entered incorrectly. Someone had typed 100 units instead of 10 units. A single missed decimal. A mistake that would have been caught by the automated pharmacy system, which flagged dosages outside normal ranges, but not in time to prevent the order from reaching the nursing station. She was raising her hand to ask Hayes about it, just a question, a clarification, the kind of thing that happened a dozen times per shift, when he appeared in the medication station doorway. Something wrong. His voice had already assumed the tone of someone dealing with an inferior who was about to inconvenience them. The insulin order for room for 12, Rachel said. I think there's a decimal point issue. The order shows 100 units, but the patient's typical. The order is correct. He didn't look at it. He didn't check the chart. He simply said it with the certainty of someone who had already decided what the answer would be before the question was asked. Rachel's training in hospital protocol and her training in operational security collided. One told her to defer. One told her that 100 units of insulin could kill a patient in approximately 40 minutes. One told her to keep her head down. One told her that she hadn't survived 3 tours and a dead husband and a life of shadows to watch someone die because she was afraid of losing a temporary job. The standing protocol is, Rachel said, keeping her voice steady, that dosages more than double the patient's baseline are flagged for physician verification. The patient's average daily insulin is. Are you questioning my medical judgment, Ms. Torres? Hayes stepped forward. His presence moved the air in the room. Because I'm pretty sure your license says nurse, not doctor. Every head on the night shift turned. The ER tech pretending not to listen but definitely listening. The charge nurse suddenly very interested in the medication cart. The security guard stationed at the desk, whose presence Rachel hadn't even registered until he straightened slightly, as if receiving a signal. No, doctor, Rachel said. She said it quietly. She said it with her hand still and her eyes steady. I'm asking for clarification on a dosing protocol that affects patient safety. Clarification. He smiled that thin smile again. You're asking for clarification. And if I told you security needs to escort you out of the hospital because I believe you're a liability to operations, would you ask for clarification on that too? The silence that followed was the kind that happened in emergency rooms before someone coded. The kind where everyone is holding their breath. I could make one phone call, Hayes said, and have you removed from this facility. Off the night shift. Off the floor entirely. Off the property. Do you understand what I'm telling you? Rachel understood. She understood that he knew she'd seen something. She understood that the escalation had moved from social to institutional, from mockery to power. She understood that her presence at Seattle General had become a problem that he was actively trying to solve. I understand, doctor, she said. Good. He turned to the security guard. If she questions a medication order again, she's done. Clear. Clear, the guard said. Rachel recognized the hesitation in his voice, the pause before compliance that suggested he wasn't entirely comfortable with the instruction but understood that this was a power structure he couldn't challenge. Hayes left without another word. Rachel stood at the medication station, her hand still steady, her breathing still measured, and entered the verification note into the system. Dosage accepted as written. The insulin would be delivered to room for 12 in approximately 20 minutes. Either someone else would catch it, or they would manage the patient accordingly. She had done what she could do. She had asked the question. She had stated the concern. She had exhausted the options available to someone who was just a nurse. The rain came at 11:47 p.m., the kind of rain that fell sideways and soaked everything within 3 seconds. Rachel stood at her late husband's grave in Section 4 of Northside Memorial Cemetery, her scrubs already dark with water, the uniform collar of her jacket turned up against weather that was far too late to protect against. The headstone was simple granite. Name. Dates. Nothing that could possibly explain who he was, what he'd meant, or why standing in the rain talking to a piece of stone made more sense than going home and sleeping. I couldn't hold the line, am I a more, she whispered. The rain hammered around her like shrapnel. Like the sound of mortars landing beyond the perimeter of a phi base. Like the noise that meant everything was about to fall apart. I failed you. I failed them all. David had been Special Operations Support. Not a SEAL, but close to it. The kind of man who understood that some jobs required you to be visible in places where you didn't belong, and invisible in places where you did. He died in a vehicle accident in 2019, and Rachel had spent the 5 years since learning how to speak to him without speaking. How to exist in the world without him knowing that she was doing it. The mission at Seattle General was supposed to be simple. 30 days. Observe the pharmaceutical supply chain. Document irregularities. Identify the leak that was funneling medical-grade opioids to black market dealers who were supplying arms networks in Central America. A nurse's position was ideal for it, invisible, trusted with access, moving between floors without drawing attention. But Hayes knew something. Or suspected something. And instead of the standard institutional jealousy or professional territorial behavior, he was actively dismantling her presence. Every restriction a message. Every reassignment a reminder that he controlled whether she stayed or left. I'm running out of time, Rachel said to the headstone. The rain was freezing now, that particular cold that comes when winter is thinking about arriving. Her breath came out in small clouds. If I lose access, the whole operation fails. 6 months of deployment. Ruined. And the network keeps moving weapons. People die that we could have stopped. The headstone didn't answer. It never did. But standing here, in the rain, with water running down her neck and her hands numb from cold, Rachel could almost feel him listening. Almost feel the weight of his disappointment. Not that he disappointed her, he never had. But that she had disappointed him by accepting this assignment in the first place. By agreeing to become invisible again. She stayed until her teeth were chattering, until the rain had soaked through to her skin, until standing any longer would have been a choice about hypothermia rather than devotion. Then she turned away from the grave and walked back toward the cemetery gates, her footsteps leaving dark prints on the wet grass that the rain immediately began to erase. By morning, there would be no trace that she'd ever been there. The monitors started screaming at 2:47 a.m. Rachel was 2 floors above room 408, restocking the supply cart on the cardiac ward, when the code blue alarm split the silence like a surgical blade. Her hands froze mid-motion. The intercom crackled, staticky and urgent, code blue, room 408. Cardiac arrest. All personnel respond. She didn't think. She moved. The elevator took 17 seconds. She counted every one of them. Room 408 was cardiac telemetry, the commander's room. The elevator doors slid open and she was running, scrubs whispering against her legs, her badge clapping against her ribs like a metronome keeping time with her heartbeat. The hallway tilted slightly. Around her, nurses were mobilizing in that controlled chaos that happened when death showed up unannounced. She pushed through the double doors and the world contracted to a single bed. The commander lay rigid, his chest rising and falling with the mechanical violence of the defibrillator pads. His face was grey. His lips were already the color of old bruises. The resident, a thin man named Morrison who'd spent 6 weeks treating hypertension, was performing chest compressions with the desperation of someone who'd never actually had someone die on him before. The monitor showed a rhythm that wasn't a rhythm, organized chaos, electrical noise that meant his heart was trying to beat but something was stopping it. Tamponade. The word formed in her mind with absolute certainty. Blood filling the pericardial sac. The heart drowning in its own chamber. Morrison was doing everything wrong. 30 compressions, he was saying, his voice cracking. Charge to 200. Everyone clear. Rachel stepped in. She didn't announce herself. She didn't ask permission. She simply moved to the bedside and her hand closed over Morrison's wrist, stopping him mid-compression. Stop, she said. Quiet. Final. What are you doing? Morrison's face was flushed, panic-bright. Rachel was already pulling supplies from the crash cart. 14-gauge angiocath. Syringe. The room had gone very quiet. The monitor was still screaming, but everyone else had frozen because something in her voice had suggested that she knew exactly what was happening and they didn't. Tamponade, she said. Blood in the pericardium. He's not having an MI. He's drowning. She didn't look up. I need a chest tube kit. Catheter. Someone get me an ultrasound probe in the next 8 seconds or he dies in the next 60. A nurse she'd never seen before moved. Just moved. That was the thing about Captain Rachel Torres, even in a wrinkled temp badge and hospital-issued scrubs, when she spoke in a voice like that, people listened. The ultrasound probe was in her hand 17 seconds later. Across the cardiac monitor, the rhythm was deteriorating. The organized electrical chaos was becoming disorganized. His heart was giving up. There was no time for consent forms or attending physicians or the proper hierarchy of who got to make decisions. There was only time for the training that had been burned into her muscle memory across 7 years and 2 combat tours and the night she'd carried 3 wounded SEALs through a kill zone in Ramadi while bullets were writing their own poetry through the night air. She pushed the probe against his chest. There. 2 centimeters of fluid filling the space around his heart. The blood was dark on the ultrasound screen, almost black. His heart was a fist pounding inside a water balloon. Get me the pericardiocentesis kit. It wasn't a request. It was a command, the kind that had made junior officers snap to attention in prefab tents under stars that looked wrong because they were on the other side of the world. The kit arrived. Her hands moved. The needle went in at the 5th intercostal space, just below the xiphoid process. She could feel the pop of tissue giving way, the small resistance and then nothing as the needle breached the pericardium. Blood rushed backward into the syringe. Dark. Thick. Still warm. The first 50 milliliters of blood came out in one pull, and something shifted in the room's electric charge. The monitor beeped differently. Just once. The rhythm tightened. 72, someone whispered, reading the oxygen saturation. She continued. Steady hands. No hesitation. The blood kept coming, filling the syringe, life returning in negative space. Every milliliter she pulled out of the sac was pressure she was releasing from his failing heart. The sensory memory hit her sideways, sudden and vivid as a slap, the smell of diesel and dust from the Humvee, the weight of the commander's body in her arms as she dragged him across 300 meters of open ground while the insurgents kept missing because they were aiming for her and she kept moving, kept breathing, kept refusing to stop. His blood had been warm then too. It had soaked into her uniform and dried there, and nobody ever asked her to explain the stains because there was no explaining Ramadi. There was only surviving it. 82, the monitor said. She pulled another 50 milliliters. The syringe was full of blood and his chest was rising easier now, less desperate. The pressure was releasing. She could feel it in the way the needle moved, less resistance, the deflated balloon finding room again. 88. 90. 92. Sinus rhythm. The monitor beeped a steady pulse. Not fast. Not slow. Human. Rachel withdrew the needle and her hands moved to the chest tube, securing the catheter with the efficiency of someone who'd done this in the dark, in the rain, with insurgent fire snapping past her ears like angry wasps. She taped it down. Labeled it. Looked at the commander's face and saw his color already returning, the gray giving way to something closer to human. His breathing was easier now, the ventilator's rhythm less frantic. She stepped back. The room was absolutely silent except for the machines. 12 people stood frozen, watching her, and she could feel their attention the way you feel heat, everyone looking, trying to understand what they'd just witnessed. Morrison was staring at her like she'd just performed a miracle instead of basic emergency medicine, which meant he'd learned his trauma training from a textbook instead of from experience. A nurse in the corner had her hand over her mouth. The resident from the ICU was reading her name tag. Rachel turned away and started removing her gloves. That was when Dr. Hayes appeared in the doorway. He'd come from the ICU stairwell, his surgical coat buttoned with precision, his face arranged in the kind of calm that only existed in people who'd never had to make actual decisions. He looked at the commander's stabilized vitals, then at Rachel, then at the empty syringe still in the kidney tray. "Who performed the pericardiocentesis?" he asked. Nobody answered. "Nurse." He was looking at Rachel. "I asked a question." Rachel met his eyes with the kind of steady gaze that had made hostile interrogators look away first. "The patient required immediate intervention. Tamponade. The catheter prevented cardiac arrest. You performed an invasive procedure on my patient." It wasn't a question. Rachel kept her voice level, the way she'd kept it level through every insult he'd thrown at her for the past 6 weeks. "Yes. That," Dr. Hayes said slowly, "is not a nurse's scope of practice. That is a felony charge called practicing medicine without a license." He turned away from her and addressed Morrison. "Document everything. Every detail. This incident goes to the board." He paused at the doorway. "And security will need to have a conversation with this temp about her employment status." He left. The room exhaled. Rachel pulled off her second glove and disposed of them in the red biohazard bin. She could feel her heart rate climbing, not from adrenaline but from the slow-burning recognition of what had just happened. She'd saved his life. And he'd just decided to end hers. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd just blown her cover completely. The mission, 7 weeks of surveillance, 17 nights of being invisible while she documented the supply chain irregularities that pointed to someone inside Seattle General moving opioids to black market dealers, was burning down in real time. Hayes would have her escorted out before her shift ended. The hospital access that had taken her 6 months to establish would be gone by sunrise. And the operation, the whole careful intelligence apparatus that Naval Command had built around her presence here, would be ash. She looked at the commander one more time. His eyes were still closed. The tattoo on his forearm was visible where the 4 line didn't cover it, the date and time they'd shared, her name in permanent ink, a memory he no longer had access to. She'd carried him 3 miles through enemy fire. She'd never told him it was her who did it. And now he would never know. Rachel Torres, Captain, United States Navy SEAL Team 3, walked out of room 408 and left her mission bleeding out on the floor behind her. The incident report sat on Dr. Hayes's desk at 4:17 a.m., each word precisely calculated. Rachel Torres. Practicing medicine without a license. Emergency pericardiocentesis. Non-physician invasive procedure. The documentation was flawless, timestamps, witness statements, protocol violations itemized in triplicate. He'd learned long ago that paper was sharper than any scalpel. It left no bruises. It left no room for argument. By 6 a.m., he'd already called the state nursing board. His voice had been calm, reasonable, almost regretful as he explained the obscure regulation, the one buried in Section 247.3 that prohibited any non-physician from performing percutaneous decompression procedures, regardless of clinical necessity or patient outcome. The board representative had listened. The board representative had taken notes. By 7:30 a.m., there was an official inquiry pending. What Hayes understood, what made him dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with a scalpel, was that destruction required patience. He'd built a documentation trail over 3 months, the missed shift, the chart note about her questionable judgment, the incident from 2 weeks ago when she'd questioned a medication order. Each entry was meticulously filed. Each one stood alone as nothing. Together, they were a noose. By noon, he had 14 pages. 14 pages of pattern concerns. 14 pages of reasonable doubt. 14 pages of a nurse who was competent right up until the moment she wasn't. He called her into his office at 2:43 p.m. Rachel stood in the doorway. The office was all floor-to-ceiling glass and mahogany desk and sunlight that made everything look clean. He gestured to the chair across from him. Saturday. I've made a decision, Hayes said, not looking at her. He was reviewing the folder in front of him, the one that contained everything. Effective immediately, you're terminated. Hospital policy violation. Scope of practice infringement. The state board has already been notified. They'll be contacting you within 48 hours regarding the formal complaint. Rachel's face didn't change. Then it did, a subtle shift, like a door closing behind her eyes. Her skin went pale, the kind of pale that happens when blood leaves the face and doesn't come back. You saved his life, Hayes continued, still not looking at her. The irony is almost perfect. In trying to be a hero, you've ended your nursing career before it even started. The board will likely recommend disciplinary action. Depending on their review, you could face license suspension or permanent revocation. I've been very thorough. He finally looked at her. He was smiling the way apex predators smile, all teeth, no warmth. It wasn't a request, he said quietly. It was a command. Rachel reached for her badge. The laminated ID that had been her identity for 8 months. The ID that meant access. The ID that meant she could move through the hospital's lower floors, near the supply pharmacy, where the opioid theft was happening. Where she'd been 2 weeks away from identifying the supply chain breach, the one that led to a black market arms dealer in East Atlanta moving weapons through a medical distribution network. She unclipped it. Set it on his desk. The plastic made a soft sound against the mahogany. The department heads have all been notified, Hayes said. Security will escort you from the premises. Collect your belongings from your locker. You have 20 minutes. She stood. She didn't ask questions. She didn't argue. She did exactly what a quiet nurse would do. She nodded once and turned toward the door. Oh, Hayes said as her hand touched the frame. One more thing. That patient you played hero for? Commander something or other? He's being transferred to Walter Reed tomorrow. Naval Care. Seems his unit has taken quite an interest in him. Your heroics accelerated his discharge. At least you have that. Rachel didn't turn around. She left the office and walked toward the locker room with her spine straight and her breathing controlled and every muscle in her body running at a frequency only trained soldiers could maintain. The locker room was empty at 3 p.m. on a Thursday. Grey metal, 20 individual compartments, the kind of place where lives got compressed into cardboard boxes. Her locker was 3rd row, left side. She opened it. Scrubs. 2 pairs of comfortable shoes with reinforced arches. A phone charger. A half-empty bottle of hand lotion. And at the very bottom, under everything else, the jacket she'd worn on her first day. It was a civilian jacket. Blue. Nothing special. But when she pulled it out, her fingers found the weight in the left lining, the weight that had been there since she'd sewed it in 6 months ago. The faded unit patch from SEAL Team 3. Charlie Platoon. Ramadi, 2011. The patch from the night she'd carried for wounded SEALs through a kill zone, taking fire meant for the commander who was now staring at her from his hospital bed with no recognition at all. She held it for exactly 4 seconds. Then she stuffed it back in the jacket and left the locker room. Security was waiting at the main entrance. 2 hospital security officers with radios and expressions that suggested they'd been told to be professional about this. She walked past them into the Atlanta afternoon, where the air was thick and warm and tasted like exhaust. It was 4:17 p.m. when she sat on a bench at the bus stop 3 blocks away. The rain came 15 minutes later, the kind of rain that falls from a sky that's already made up its mind about everything. Fat drops hitting concrete. Running in rivulets down the bench slats. Soaking through the shoulders of her jacket. No one bothered her. People at bus stops in Atlanta at 4:30 p.m. in the rain were invisible. That's what Rachel had always understood about being alone in public. Invisibility was a choice. You made yourself small enough and quiet enough and no one asked questions. She sat there until 7 p.m. The rain didn't stop. It got worse, hammering the pavement like something angry, like something with a point to make. She held the jacket in her lap. Her uniform collar was turned up against the cold. Even though Atlanta in September wasn't actually cold, it was the kind of cold that came from inside. Her phone showed 3 missed calls. 2 from the Navy intelligence liaison who'd placed her here. 1 from her mother. No voicemail from any of them. Just the absence. Just the silence that meant they were all waiting to hear what she was going to say. The wallet in her scrub pocket held $47. Not enough for a motel. Enough for a bus ticket somewhere. Enough for coffee and nothing else. She sat there at 8:15 p.m., in the rain, with her uniform turning dark with moisture and her hand starting to shake in a way that wasn't fear. Pain is data, her old commander used to say. The shaking wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was 8 years of classified operations and 3 years of cover and 6 months of a mission that was supposed to matter, all of it coming apart in a single life-saving gesture. She pulled the jacket closer. Felt the patch through the lining. Her fingers traced the outline of it, that piece of fabric from a decade ago, sewn into the lining of a jacket that was supposed to keep a naval intelligence operative warm while she worked a case nobody was supposed to know about. She pulled her phone out. Almost deleted everything, the encrypted messages, the contact numbers, the photographs of the supply pharmacy logs. Almost threw the phone into the rain. Almost stood up and got on the next bus and became someone else entirely. But then something happened. A sound. Distant. Then less distant. The sound of helicopter rotors moving through air that didn't want to cooperate with them. Rachel looked up from the bench. The rotor wash hit the trees first, palm fronds whipping backward like they were being slapped. Then the spotlight, cutting through the rain in a shaft of white light that turned everything silver. And then the voice, amplified through speakers that turned the air itself into a weapon. Captain Rachel Torres. This is a U.S. Navy retrieval. Stand by for extraction. The rain stopped being rain. It became rotor wash. It became recognition. It became the sound of her own name spoken aloud in a frequency that only someone with authority could reach. Rachel stood. 3 Black Hawk helicopters were descending, their landing gear extending like talons, their spotlights painting her in white light at the corner of 14th and Piedmont in Atlanta, Georgia, in the rain, in her wet scrubs and her uniform collar and her jacket with the faded unit patch sewn into the lining. Boots hit pavement. 1, 2, 3, 4. Marines in full tactical gear, their weapons drawn but lowered, their eyes forward. They moved through the rain like it wasn't happening, like water was just another medium they passed through on their way to retrieve what belonged to them. One of them, the one with a scar that ran from his left temple to his jawline, stepped forward. "Captain," he said. His voice was steady as surgical steel. "Welcome home." The office door exploded inward. Marco, 16, lanky, breathing hard, burst through clutching a shadow box against his chest like a grenade. His eyes found Rachel across the administrator's desk, and the words tumbled out, urgent and desperate, "Mom, they need to see these, you can't just let them do this to you." The shadow box trembled in his hands. Inside, under glass, the metals caught the fluorescent light like captured stars. Dr. Hayes didn't move. He was still sitting in his leather chair, still holding the termination letter he'd slid across the desk not 3 minutes earlier. His face shifted from satisfaction to confusion in a single breath. Rachel's jaw clenched. Just a jaw clench. One measured breath. That was all. She didn't stand. Didn't reach for the box. Her eyes met her son's for exactly 2 seconds, acknowledgement, warning, apology, then returned to Hayes, flat and still. "Security," Hayes said into his phone. "Remove this person from." "Sir." The voice came from the doorway. "Junior." The security guard who'd worked the night shift for 8 months filled the frame. He was maybe 30, muscular, with a scar that split his left eyebrow and eyes that had seen things. He stepped into the office and his posture changed, shoulders squared, spine rigid, the kind of alignment that didn't come from a training video. He stared at Rachel. Not at Marco. Not at Hayes. At Rachel. Captain Rachel Torres, Naval Special Warfare Group, he said. His voice carried through the suddenly silent hallway. Not loud. Clear. The kind of voice that announces itself to whoever needs to hear it. Fallujah, 2008. You pulled my squad out of the Jolan district when we got ambushed at the water treatment plant. You were bleeding from your shoulder. You didn't stop. The hallway behind him had begun to fill. A custodian paused with his mop. A nurse froze mid-step. A visiting physician slowed, listening. Rachel's hands lay flat on the desk. They didn't shake. Hayes leaned back in his chair. The first crack of panic crossed his face. The door opened wider. A Marine general entered, dress blues with ribbons from his neck to his waist, stars on his shoulders, the kind of presence that made the air pressure change. Behind him, two more officers in Navy dress uniforms. The room itself seemed to compress around them. The general stepped forward without ceremony. He reached for the shadow box. Marco handed it to him like a relay pass, like passing the baton. The general opened the case. His eyes moved across the medals with the careful focus of a man reading scripture. He didn't rush. Purple Heart, he said aloud. His voice was granite. Purple Heart. Bronze Star with Valor. Bronze Star with Valor. A pause. The room held its breath. Silver Star for extraordinary heroism under fire. He looked up from the box. His eyes found Rachel. 3 wounded SEALs. 3 miles through the Ramadi kill zone. Incoming from 3 positions. He closed the box. She didn't leave anyone behind. The silence lasted exactly 10 seconds. In those 10 seconds, Dr. Hayes' face drained of blood the way a body empties when the heart stops. His hand moved toward the desk. Stopped. Moved again. Stopped. His mouth opened. Closed. Opened. The commander appeared in the doorway still wearing his hospital gown, for line trailing from his arm. He was gaunt, stitched together, moving like a man holding himself together by will alone. In his right hand, he held something faded and fragile, a unit patch, desert tan, edges worn soft from being handled 10,000 times. He looked at Rachel. Actually looked at her. Recognition flickered across his face, and then something broke behind his eyes. You found it, he said quietly. In my jacket. Sewn inside the lining. His voice wavered. Steadied. I found it this morning and I remembered. Not you, but the memory of you. The weight of your hands. The sound of your voice telling me to breathe. He stepped forward. The 4 line swayed. You took 9 bullets meant for me and still got us home. Rachel's eyes glistened. 1 tear escaped. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, without flinching, without any of the fragility that might have betrayed her. When she spoke, her voice had transformed, an octave lower, each word carved from steel. Welcome home, Commander. Hayes stood. Actually stood, knocking his chair backward. This is insane, he said. His voice cracked. She practiced medicine without a license. There are regulations, there are protocols, I have documentation. You have fabricated documentation, the general said. Not a question. A statement. Boots on tile. The general moved, and the room reorganized itself around him. You have altered post-operative complication records. You have systematically isolated and harassed a naval intelligence operative conducting an authorized investigation within your hospital. The general's face was a study in controlled fury. And you attempted to obstruct that operation by restricting her access and filing false complaints with the State Nursing Board. Hayes' hands were shaking now. Actually shaking. There's been a misunderstanding. I was protecting hospital standards. But that wasn't the worst part. That night, as the video went viral, Marco had recorded it, had live-streamed the entire confrontation as it happened. Someone else was watching. Someone who'd shaped the man Hayes thought he'd become. Dr. Sterling, Hayes's mentor from Johns Hopkins Medical School, the surgeon who'd sponsored his fellowship, the man whose name appeared on Hayes's LinkedIn profile under Influences, he watched the video at 11:47 p.m. in his home office. He watched his protégé sneer at a decorated war hero. He watched Hayes's hands shake as medals were read aloud. He watched the slow realization that his former student had become something he'd never intended to create. Sterling picked up the phone at 6:15 a.m. the next morning. He called the hospital board president. Then he called the state medical board. Then he sent an email to 847 surgeons across the Southeast with the subject line, "I can no longer in good conscience endorse Dr. Julian Hayes." The ethics review began 17 hours later. The records were pulled, 47 case files with falsified complications data. The timestamps didn't match the medication logs. The post-op reports described outcomes that contradicted the patient charts by 180 degrees. A patient marked as routine recovery had spent 4 hours in the ICU with a collapsed lung. Another listed as no complications had suffered a pulmonary embolism that took 6 weeks of anticoagulation to resolve. Each one carefully curated to keep the hospital's surgical mortality rate in the top 10th percentile. Each one a small lie stacked on 1,000 other small lies. The board suspended his license pending criminal investigation on day 2. The U.S. Attorney's Office opened a case on day 4. His wife filed for divorce on day 5. 6 months later, Rachel was driving through downtown Atlanta on her way to her new office at the Naval Intelligence Operations Center when she saw him. A medical supply van, white and unmarked, pulled to the curb outside a strip mall urgent care clinic. The driver's door opened. A man climbed out wearing khaki pants and a polo shirt with MedServ Solutions embroidered across the pocket. His hands gripped the steering wheel with white knuckles as he stood, moment just before closing the door. She could see his face for 3 seconds. He looked like a ghost of himself, hollow, hunched, the weight of everything he destroyed visible in every line of his body. The nameplate on his polo said Steve. He'd requested the name change from his new employer. It was easier that way. Fewer people recognized him. Fewer people turned away. Rachel didn't slow down. She passed the van and kept driving. The Naval Intelligence Operations Center occupied 3 floors of a nondescript building off Peachtree Road. When Rachel walked in wearing her navy dress uniform, the blues crisp, the jacket tailored, the pins on her collar catching the light, the entire command staff was waiting. Petty Officer First Class Gator stood at attention. The tactical operations coordinators stopped mid-briefing. The signals intelligence analysts looked up from their screens. She stepped forward. The general, the same one who'd read her medals aloud in Hayes's office, was there with the crossed rifle insignia of a Navy captain, promotion boards, and a citation that read simply, "For extraordinary service to naval intelligence." She raised her right hand. Her left hand moved to her collar. The insignia went on smooth and sure, the same rank her husband had worn, the same rank he'd died for in Jalabad, the same rank she'd earned in Ramadi carrying 3 men through the kind of fire that doesn't spare. Marco stood beside her in his rock cadet grays, pressed and perfect, his chin high with the kind of pride that only exists when a child finally understands what their parent actually is. Beside the captain's insignia on her collar sat a framed photograph of her husband and a frame holding the faded unit patch, preserved under glass. Captain Rachel Torres, the general said, assumes command of Joint Intelligence Task Force 7, effective immediately. Your first assignment waits in the SCIF. Welcome home. She stood in the uniform that fit her like skin, and something in her shoulders relaxed, not the relaxation of surrender, but the relaxation of finally setting down a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten it was there. The next patient came through her clinic door 30 minutes later. A construction worker with a lacerated hand. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that required a Navy officer. Just a patient who needed someone to stitch him back together. Rachel washed her hands, pulled on gloves, blew nitrile that snapped like gunshots in the silence, and got to work. Because commanding an intelligence task force was her new title, but this was still her calling. She could wear the uniform. She could pin on the stars. She could oversee operations across 3 continents. But her fight was here. With her hands. With people who needed mending. The trembling wasn't fear. It was restraint, the discipline of choosing where to spend your rage, your skill, your capacity for violence. Of choosing instead to heal. A captain walks into a clinic wearing dress blues under her white coat. The patients don't know her rank. They don't know her kill count. They don't know she carried 3 men through enemy fire and lived. They just know that when she touches their wounds, something shifts. Something settles. The trembling stops because her hands are steady as surgical lasers and her voice carries the weight of someone who's already survived the worst that can happen. 3 months later, the hospital announced the creation of the Admiral James Torres Memorial Veterans Trauma Wing, 15 beds dedicated to active duty and veteran care, staffed by combat medics and former military nurses, funded by a donation from the hospital board's new chair after she'd pushed for accountability. 2 years later, Hayes was convicted of wire fraud, falsifying medical records, and obstruction of justice. He served 14 months of an 18-month sentence. The prison didn't have him driving a van anymore, his release conditions prohibited him from working in any healthcare setting. Last anyone saw, he was working the overnight shift at a truck stop outside Nashville, restocking shelves and not talking to anyone. Rachel pinned medals on junior sailors now. She wrote commendations for enlisted personnel. She made decisions that mattered to people she'd never meet. But every Thursday, she volunteered at the clinic. Every Thursday, she wore her white coat over her uniform and stitched people back together with the same hands that had carried the commander 3 miles through Ramadi. The commander came by the clinic sometimes. He still had her name tattooed on his forearm. Now they could sit in silence together and it didn't hurt because the forgetting wasn't permanent. The memory had come back, piece by piece, the way a photograph develops in water. One evening after her shift, the barista at the coffee shop on the corner, the one where Rachel had started going after she moved back to Atlanta, wrote a number on her cup. Just a number. No name, no message. She almost smiled. Almost. She pocketed the cup. Some fights aren't meant to be won. Some are meant to be lived. You don't need a badge or a gun to be a warrior. You just need hands steady enough to hold someone together when they're falling apart, and the discipline to keep your power quiet until the moment it matters most. If you've ever been underestimated by someone in power, subscribe now. Because the ones the world overlooks are often the ones changing it.